story I had done for NPR, and what really strikes me about the film and the lessons from it is that, you know, sometimes you think, well, these stereotypes go back, that the prejudice has always been in the United States, or sometimes you hear, well, the Jews and Arabs have been fighting for thousands of years, or the Croats and the Serbs are now the Shias and the Sunnis have been fighting for thousands of years. Well, whenever you hear that, make a mental note, because it's probably not true, or it's a distortion of what is true. Let me take a very recent example. And it does, what's really interesting, and I'm talking about the vilification of the French in this country in 2002, 2003. Remember that? Now, what's really interesting about that one is that there is no historical antagonism towards the French here, right? I mean, they're white, they have good food, we like to travel to their country. I mean, what's the hate about the French, right? But in the context, in the run-up to the Iraq War, the French had veto power in the United Nations. They were threatening to use it to stop the U.S. from getting UN approval for going to war in Iraq. So the Bush administration pulled out all the stops. Karl Rove intentionally orchestrated a campaign to vilify the French people in order to pressure France into not vetoing the U.S. Move to go into Iraq. And so we saw all this stuff about suddenly the French had been surrender monkeys and they're wine-swilling, brie-eating, horrible people, and we saved their butts in World War II, and what do we get paid back for it? And we got to name them Freedom Fries. And my favorite one is that Woody Allen said he's now going to be forced to freedom kiss his wife. And so you have all of this xenophobic hatred of the French. Why? Designed for those in power to achieve a particular aim, and it wasn't a criticism of the French government. It was a criticism of all of the French people as a way to go after the French government. So we see that, of course, going against Arabs and Iraqis. We see that against Iranians. So every time you hear somebody say, oh, those people have been fighting each other for thousands of years, think back on whether, in fact, who's benefiting from that particular myth. I want to talk tonight mostly about what's in my book, The Iran Agenda. In 2005, I was in Tehran to cover the presidential elections, and I went there with Sean Penn and Norman Solomon, two people who you're, I think, familiar with in this area. And Sean went not as an actor, but as a correspondent for the San Francisco Chronicle, and his 5-part series is actually still available. If you want to Google Sean Penn and San Francisco Chronicle, it'll pop up. And he was very much interested in meeting ordinary people and figuring out what the ordinary people of Iran thought about their government and about U.S. policy and so on. So I arranged for us to go into the Tehran Bazaar, the shopping mall, the ancient shopping mall, if you will, of Iran. And Norman and I were speaking to a merchant, and we were asking him about, the heavy-duty questions. Is Iran developing nuclear weapons? Do you think that's a good idea? What do you think about U.S.-Iran relations and so on? And the guy's answering it. Who are you going to vote for president? And then Sean walked up. He had been talking to somebody else. And the merchant turns to me and he says, God, your friend looks just like Sean Penn. Oh my God, it is Sean Penn. I know I've seen all of your movies. I know everything about you. I'm a real expert. I knew you were married to Madonna. What's she like? So we go halfway across the world to ask the Iranians to get to know what ordinary Iranians think about all these heavy-duty political questions, and they want to know about Madonna. And what we found was, universally, I've been to Iran now 3 times, the Iranians are extremely friendly to the American people. They are literally would walk up on the street, they find out that I was American, invite me to, a complete stranger, invite me to dinner at their house. They are also very much opposed to U.S. policy. And they know a lot. They know far more about the U.S., U.S. people, and U.S. policy than 99.9% of Americans know about Iran. That is for sure. And what was interesting is I had a chance to interview the leaders of all the popular movements in Iran. I mean, Iran is a repressive, authoritarian government. It's certainly no democracy. The people of Iran are fighting against the lack of union rights, the lack of student rights, the lack of women's rights, the lack of human rights, and they have organizations that have called strikes and held demonstrations, etc. And I spoke with the leaders of all of those movements, including Shirin Ebadi, the 2003 Nobel Peace Prize winner. And what she and every one of these other leaders said was, the Bush administration's policies towards Iran are a disaster. The allocation of money to so-called promote democracy in Iran, it only hurts us, the people actually fighting. The government accuses us of being tools of the Bush administration. The U.S. should not only not attack Iran militarily, it should stop all sanctions, it should stop and reverse the UN votes. All of these pressure tactics that the U.S. is supposedly putting the screws to Iran to force them to change, to make them more democratic, are having exactly the opposite effect. But of course, that viewpoint is either not reported or not reported adequately in the U.S. media. Why? Because it runs completely counter to everything that the United States, in fact, is doing towards Iran. The Iranians, the United States' actual objective in putting these screws on is not to promote democracy in Iran, but to overthrow the government there and bring in a pro-U.S. regime. That's it. The U.S. has absolutely no interest in free and fair democratic elections in Iran, because the people who would get elected in that circumstances would not be any more pro-U.S. than the people in power now. They would be less repressive of the people in Iran, but there's no popular sentiment for another Shah, let's say, right? The Iranians had their experience with U.S. spreading democracy when the U.S. overthrew their democratic government and brought in the Shah. In 2006, I flew from Tehran to northern Iraq. Northern Iraq is called the KRG, or the Kurdish Regional Government. It's the area the Kurds control. It's virtually an independent state, although formally affiliated with Iraq. It's really interesting. The cheapest, most reliable way to get into northern Iraq is from Tehran. You can fly 3-4 times a week on flights into Erbil or Sulaymaniyah, the two leading cities of northern Iraq. And it's easier and cheaper to get there than from Baghdad. So you wait and see. I don't know if it'll be a months or years from now. The U.S. will say, oh my God, the Iranians are having undue influence on the Kurds, and they're doing this and they're that and that. And they're supporting militias or something, blah, 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 some new cranked up myths about Iran. The Iranians have had long-standing ties with the Kurds going back many years, and the fact that you can get there, and there's business dealings and trade and so on, and a lot of support among the Iraqi Kurdish parties for Iran is a well-known fact. The reason I went there was to interview Iranian Kurdish groups that are fighting the government in Tehran, and they're all based in northern Iran. But what I discovered when I got there was that the KRG is a hotbed of crooked arms dealers, shady journalists, spies, and everybody's spying on everybody else. The Americans are spying on the Iranians. The Iranians are spying on the Kurds. The Kurds are spying on the Turks, and the Turks are spying on the Americans, and they all meet in one hotel. And as an investigative journalist, I felt it my duty to visit that hotel.